A millionaire entrepreneur, Mr. Marcus Tan, returned to his sprawling good-class bungalow estate and saw something that stopped his world cold. His two twin daughters, Emily and Isabel, who had been in complete silence for 3 years after their mother's death, were running and laughing amidst the lush tropical greenery of the garden. But the real shock came when he saw who was with them. It was Lena, the new housekeeper, a woman he barely knew. In just a few days, this woman had achieved what the best therapists and all his money could not. She had brought joy back to his daughters. But what no one expected was that within that silent mansion, a war was about to begin. And when the truth finally exploded at the dining table, the girls themselves would reveal a secret so profound that it would change that family forever. Tell us where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to receive more stories like this. Grab your popcorn. The story begins now. To understand the magnitude of that moment in the garden, we need to go back a few weeks, to a time when the Emerald Manor operated with the silent precision of a stopped clock. The house, an imposing colonial-style mansion of gleaming white and dark timber accents that dominated the prime district, was not a home, but a mausoleum, erected in honor of a forbidden memory. Each morning, the sun tried to break through the heavy designer blinds that dressed the large windows, but its light was always defeated, reduced to timid rays that barely managed to illuminate the dust suspended in the air. The corridors, spacious and clad in cool marble, echoed steps that were never joyful. The scent of freshly polished timber and fragrant lilies, instead of evoking life, seemed like the artificial perfume of a funerary chapel, a constant effort to mask the aroma of stagnation and sorrow that permeated every corner of that place, as luxurious as it was desolate. The domestic staff had internalized the unwritten rules of the house with almost military discipline. They glided through the rooms like shadows. Their shoes felt lined so as not to disturb the sacred silence. Conversations were whispers, doors closed with reverential care, and orders were executed with an efficiency that eliminated any need for human interaction. The peace that reigned in the mansion was not serenity, but the stillness of absence, a calm imposed by the fear of awakening, a pain that everyone knew lurked beneath the surface. It was the perfect order of a frozen world where every object had its assigned place and every emotion was rigorously suppressed. Any hint of spontaneity, any accidental laughter, or any gesture too lively was perceived as a transgression, a lack of respect for the perpetual mourning that Marcus had decreed without words. At the heart of this controlled universe was Marcus's study, his true fortress. It was a dim room, lined with mahogany panels and shelves, crammed with books no one read. There, behind an imposing desk, he sought refuge from the chaos of his own feelings. He immersed himself in spreadsheets, production reports, and market strategies with feverish concentration, finding solace in the cold, unforgiving logic of numbers. His tech empire, the family business, had become his perfect alibi, an excuse not to be present, not to have to face the empty eyes of his daughters. He believed, or forced himself to believe, that his duty as a father consisted of securing their material future, unaware that while building a legacy of wealth, he was demolishing the emotional foundations of his own family, brick by brick, day after day. His role as a father had been reduced to a series of mechanical and distant rituals, devoid of any warmth. Every evening, before dinner, he paid a brief visit to the girls' playroom, a huge, aseptic space that looked more like a luxury toy store display than the room of two 6-year-old girls. He stood on the threshold, observing them without fully entering. Emily and Isabel, identical in their fragile beauty and their aura of abandonment, would usually be sitting on the floor, surrounded by porcelain dolls and complex constructions with which they interacted without emitting a single sound, without a spark of joy in their eyes. He would address them with a rehearsed question, "Everything all right, little ones?" And they would nod with a slight movement of their heads, without looking up. For Marcus, that stillness was confirmation that his system worked, that they were safe. He didn't see silence, he saw obedience. The girls' room was the epicenter of the family's silent tragedy. The walls painted in pastel tones and the pristine white furniture created an atmosphere of unreal purity. But the toys, though expensive and abundant, remained in almost perfect order, as if afraid to be used, to create disorder, to provoke life. The girls did not play. They executed repetitive movements with their dolls, combing their hair over and over again, or dressing them with exasperating slowness. There were no fights, no shouts, no running. There was nothing that defined childhood. Their behavior was a perfect reflection of the house's atmosphere, an unnatural containment, a repression of all vital impulses. They were two small porcelain statues in a golden display cabinet, beautiful, untouched, and completely broken inside, waiting for someone to dare to break the glass. There were signs, small cries for help that Marcus, in his voluntary blindness, refused to interpret. At the table, the girls barely tasted the food that the cook carefully prepared for them. They pushed the rice grains around their plates with their forks, building small white mounds without eating almost anything. Mess. Lim, the stern and efficient tutor, informed him of this with a note of concern in her daily report, but Marcus attributed it to childish whims. More alarming was their inability to hold his gaze. When he spoke to them, their eyes would drift to an undefined point on the wall or floor, as if his presence were too intense, too painful to bear. It was a subtle yet profound disconnection, an invisible barrier they had erected to protect themselves from him. The architect of their emotional prison, the greatest of taboos. The wound festering at the center of their lives was their mother's name, Sophia. Any mention, however innocent, was met with a dense, cutting silence. If a new employee, unaware of the rules, commented on how much Madame Sophia loved a particular orchid, Marcus would glare at them and change the subject with a blood-chilling abruptness. The girls, upon hearing the forbidden name, visibly recoiled as if a freezing draft had swept through the room. He believed he was protecting them from the pain of memory, but what he was actually doing was turning their mother into a ghost, an unmentionable presence whose love had transformed into a source of fear and shame. He was teaching them that remembering was dangerous, that loving someone who was no longer there was a mistake. It was into this suffocating environment that Lena made her appearance, hired through an agency to fill a vacancy in the cleaning staff. For her first few weeks, she was little more than a shadow, an anonymous figure clad in a simple uniform who moved through the house with the same discretion as the rest. No one paid her special attention. For Marcus, she was just a name on a payroll. For Miss Lim and the rest of the staff, she was a newcomer who still needed to learn the complex map of silences and prohibitions of the mansion. Lena, for her part, observed. She saw the blinds always drawn, noticed the untouched food on the plates she cleared from the table, and felt the oppressive lack of air in every room she cleaned. She did not judge, but she felt the weight of a sadness that could not be wiped away with a cloth and cleaning product. In her daily tasks, Lena began to introduce small acts of rebellion, almost imperceptible. While cleaning the main living area, she would draw the blinds a few centimeters more than strictly necessary, allowing a rebellious ray of sun to slip in and dance on the parquet floor. As she passed a vase, she would rearrange the flowers with a delicacy that made them seem more alive. One day, while cleaning the playroom, she paused for a moment to observe a portrait of Sophia with the girls, a radiant image of happiness that contrasted brutally with reality. Instead of looking away, as everyone else did, she smiled slightly at the portrait, an intimate and silent gesture of recognition. These were minuscule, insignificant acts to anyone else, but in that ecosystem of repression, each one was like a seed planted in barren ground, awaiting the opportunity to germinate and break through the concrete. Such was life at the Emerald Manor before that golden afternoon in the garden, a perfectly choreographed play about denial. Marcus lived immersed in the illusion that absolute control was a form of love, that silence was synonymous with peace, and that isolation was the only possible medicine for his daughter's broken hearts. He had built a fortress to protect them from the outside world, unaware that the real danger was not outside, but within the walls he himself had erected. The structure was impeccable, the routine infallible, and the silence total. Everything was in its place, functioning according to the plan. But the plan was fundamentally flawed, and it only took a spark, a simple child's laugh, for the entire edifice built on foundations of pain and fear to come crashing down. After the revelation in the garden, Marcus said nothing. He did not confront Lena, nor did he interrogate his daughters. He returned to the mansion and locked himself in his study. But for the first time in 3 years, he found no solace in numbers or reports. The image of his daughter's laughter replayed in his mind like a looped film, a miracle he didn't know how to interpret. The next day, he began to observe. From the dimness of his study, through half-open doors, he spied on Lena as she worked. He watched her move through the house, not as an employee performing a task, but as someone who inhabited the spaces with a quiet intent. He saw her pause to straighten a painting, to clean with unusual delicacy one of Sophia's photographs that still remained on the shelves, or simply to look out the window at the garden, as if sharing a secret with the landscape. These were minuscule gestures, but in them Marcus began to perceive a presence, a warmth that his house had lost long ago. Lena's bond with the girls was not built with grand gestures, but with the patience of a gardener tending to two fragile sprouts. It was forged in the interstitial moments of the day, in the spaces no one else seemed to value. While folding clean laundry in the utility room, she would tell them stories of stars that were the eyes of people watching over us from heaven. When she brushed their hair in the morning, a duty Miss Lim usually performed with mechanical efficiency, Lena turned it into a ritual of gentle caresses, untangling knots with a softness that seemed to undo the knots in their souls as well. She didn't ask them direct questions about their mother, but she spoke of the orchids in the garden, which ones were Sophia's favorites, with a naturalness that brought color back to memory, stripping it of mourning and taboo. Lena wasn't trying to fill a void. She was simply watering the dry earth around them, waiting for life to sprout again on its own. The first breach in the dam of silence was almost a whisper. One afternoon, while Lena cleaned the glass panels of the large living room window, Isabel approached her from behind, and with a voice barely audible, asked, "Do you think Mummy would like this drawing?" She held in her hands a paper with a cheerful sun and two small figures holding hands. Lena turned, knelt to their level, and looked at the drawing with solemn seriousness. "I'm sure she would love it," she replied, "especially because you made it." At that moment, the cook crossed the living room and froze upon hearing the girl's voice. The news spread through the house like wildfire, a murmur of astonishment and disbelief. One of the girls had spoken, and she hadn't told her father or her tutor. She had told the housekeeper. The established order began to tremble. Emily, always more introverted, showed her attachment in a different, quieter, but equally profound way. She began to follow Lena around the house like a small shadow. If Lena was cleaning the library, Emily would sit in a corner with an unread book, just watching her. In the mornings, before anyone woke up, she would leave a small wild orchid, picked from the garden, next to the door of Lena's humble room in the staff wing. It was an anonymous gift, a secret offering that only the two of them understood. For Emily, Lena had become a lighthouse, a point of calm in the ocean of her sadness. Her presence didn't demand words, didn't force her into anything. She was simply there, a serene and warm constant that allowed her, for the first time in years, to feel safe, without needing to hide behind a wall of silence. This silent attachment was even more eloquent than her sister's words. These transformations did not go unnoticed by the rest of the staff, especially Miss Lim, the tutor, a rigid, middle-aged woman who strictly followed protocols and had interpreted the girls' silence as a form of successful discipline. She saw Lena's growing influence not as a miracle, but as a dangerous subversion of order. The laughter in the garden, the whispers in the corridors, the orchids at the door, all of it was, in her eyes, proof that the employee was overstepping her duties, creating inappropriate familiarity that undermined her authority. She began to watch Lena with barely disguised hostility, noting every interaction in her mind, every shared smile, every gesture of affection, preparing to present a detailed report to Marcus about the inappropriate conduct that threatened the house's fragile stability. The report arrived on Marcus's desk one afternoon, presented by Miss Lim with an air of grave concern. The document detailed with almost clinical precision how Lena distracted the girls from their routines, how she encouraged undisciplined behavior, and how her excessive familiarity could be detrimental to their emotional development. The Marcus of a few weeks ago would have acted immediately, calling Lena to his study to coldly remind her of her place and duties. But the man who read that report was different. The image from the garden was still etched in his mind. He saw in the tutor's words not genuine concern, but the fear of an old system being replaced by something new, something it didn't understand. For the first time, he doubted his own rules. He folded the report, put it in a drawer, and said, "I'll bear it in mind." His inaction was a decision in itself, a small crack in his armor of control. One night, a stifled cry woke Lena. It came from the girl's room. Without a second thought, she got up and ran down the silent corridor. She found Emily sitting on the bed, trembling, her eyes wide with the terror of a nightmare. Isabel was silently crying beside her. The tutor, whose room was closer, had not woken up. Lena didn't turn on the main light. She sat on the edge of the bed and began to speak to them in a whisper, telling them a story about an enchanted rainforest where trees protected lost children until the sun rose. She stroked Emily's forehead until her tremors ceased, and held Isabel's hand until her tears dried. She stayed there in the dim light until both fell asleep again, feeling for the first time in a long time the warmth of a protective presence in the darkness. From the slightly ajar door, Marcus saw everything, feeling a mix of gratitude and a deep, painful shame for not having been the one. Miss Lim, feeling her warning had been ignored, decided to take more direct action. Using her authority over the girls' schedules, she began to orchestrate a subtle yet effective campaign of separation. She scheduled times when Lena was assigned to clean the bedroom wing. She forbade the girls from entering the kitchen or utility room, claiming they were dangerous workplaces. These were invisible barriers, seemingly logical rules, but designed with a single purpose: to sever the bond that was forming. Lena suddenly found her opportunities to interact with the girls reduced to fleeting encounters in the corridors, always under the watchful eye of the tutor. The house, which had begun to breathe, felt like a prison again, and Lena understood that her position was more fragile than she had imagined. The girls' reaction to this new separation was immediate and disheartening. The light that had begun to shine in their eyes dimmed again. During lessons with Miss Lim, they returned to their state of apathy, responding with monosyllables or simply with silence. Food again remained untouched on their plates. One afternoon, in an act of open rebellion, Isabel refused to do her homework and asked with defiant clarity, "Where is Lena?" The question hung in the tense air of the study room, a bomb the tutor didn't know how to defuse. For Marcus, who listened to the arguments from his study, his daughter's behavior was the ultimate proof. It wasn't Lena who was changing them. It was Lena's absence that was returning them to darkness. The tutor's experiment was failing spectacularly, proving, beyond a doubt, that the connection they had forged was real and necessary. The tension reached a new level when the phone rang one Thursday afternoon. It was Madame Chu, Marcus's mother, for her weekly control call. Her voice, always impeccable and sharp, had a steel edge. "Marcus, I've heard troubling rumors," she said without preamble. "It's being said that one of the employees is taking too many liberties with my granddaughters. I hope you know how to restore order. Everyone must remember their place. Service staff are there to serve, not to play at being family." It was clear that Miss Lim, loyal to the old regime, had found a more powerful ally. The threat was no longer internal. Now it came from the family matriarch, a woman whose opinion Marcus had never dared to contradict. The call ended, but her words resonated in the study like a sentence. That same night, the mansion seemed more silent and oppressive than ever. Lena, aware of the hostility surrounding her, felt isolated and vulnerable. She knew that any misstep could cost her her job and, worse, distance her from the girls who had begun to heal under her care. As she walked down the dormitory wing corridor to retire to her room, she paused in front of the twins' door. The tutor's rule was clear: she shouldn't go near. But instead of walking past, Lena leaned against the adjacent wall and began to hum very softly one of the lullabies she secretly sang to them, a sweet and melancholic melody about paper boats sailing towards the stars. On the other side of the door, the silence was broken by the sound of two tiny voices timidly trying to follow the tune. At the other end of the corridor, hidden in the shadows, Marcus observed the scene, and within him, the battle between filial duty and paternal love reached its most critical point. He knew that the time for observing was over. He had to make a decision, and that decision would change everything forever. Madame Chu's arrival at the Emerald Manor was like the arrival of a cold front in midsummer. Her car, a German sedan, as severe and metallic gray as her expression, pulled up to the main entrance with millimeter precision. It wasn't a visit. It was an inspection. A 70-year-old woman, erect and dressed in an immaculate linen suit that seemed immune to the dust of the road, descended from the vehicle with the authority of a queen visiting a distant colony. Her gaze swept over the house's facade, the gardens, and finally settled on her son, Marcus, who awaited her at the threshold. There was no warm embrace, only a fleeting kiss on the cheek, a gesture more formality than affection. The very air seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of her silent judgment, and the fragile atmosphere of life that had begun to bloom in the mansion contracted, bracing for the frost. Her first critical observation was not long in coming. From the living room window, with an untouched cup of tea in her hand, she witnessed a scene in the garden that made her frown with an almost imperceptible, yet cutting, disapproval. Lena and the girls were sitting on the lawn, building a small crown of jasmine flowers. Emily, with a smudge of dirt on her cheek, laughed as she tried to place the crown on her sister's head. It was an image of pure innocence, of simple, messy joy. For Madame Chu, however, it was the living image of chaos, irrefutable proof of the breakdown of norms. She saw her granddaughters, the heirs of the Tan name, rolling around in the grass like common children, and an employee fostering a familiarity she considered dangerous and completely out of place. She turned to Marcus, and, with a voice soft as velvet but sharp as glass, she pronounced, "Discipline seems to have become very lax around here. Son, that first thrust was just the beginning of a subtle but relentless campaign of pressure." During dinner, Madame Chu directed the conversation with the skill of a general, asking leading questions about the girls' routines, their studies, the management of the staff. Every question was a veiled criticism. "And this woman, Lena, what exactly are her qualifications to influence my granddaughter's education?" she asked, cutting her steak with surgical precision. She didn't expect an answer. She was sowing doubt in Marcus's mind, reminding him of his duty to lineage, to appearances. She spoke to him of the place everyone should occupy, of the importance of maintaining distance so that respect would not erode. Every word was another brick in the wall she was trying to build between Lena and the girls, a wall constructed with the mortar of tradition and the fear of what others would say. Marcus found himself caught in an emotional crossfire that paralyzed him. On one side, his mother's voice resonated in his head, an authoritarian melody he had learned to obey since childhood, representing order, control, the predictable world he himself had tried to impose in his home. Her arguments about discipline and appearances touched a sensitive chord, that of the heir to an empire who could not afford to show weakness. But on the other side was the irrefutable evidence of his own eyes. His daughter's laughter, the regained sparkle in their eyes, their first words after years of silence. Every time he looked at Emily and Isabel, he saw the tangible result of Lena's influence, a healing that no therapist or strict routine had achieved. He was torn between the man he had been raised to be and the father he desperately yearned to become. Lena, with her sharp emotional intelligence, immediately felt the change in the atmosphere. Madame Chu's presence was a shadow that fell over every corner of the house. She felt her scrutinizing gaze following her down the corridors. She noticed how staff conversations abruptly ceased when she entered a room. Miss Lim, now emboldened by the matriarch's support, had regained her former rigidity, interrupting any interaction between Lena and the girls with excuses about schedules and duties. Lena understood that she was no longer fighting only against the sadness of the house, but against an established power system that saw her as an anomaly, a piece that did not fit into its perfectly ordered machinery. She moved with more caution, aware that every gesture of affection towards the girls was now an act of subversion that could cost her everything. The girls, like sensitive seismographs to the slightest emotional vibration, reacted to their grandmother's presence with an instinctive retreat. The spontaneity and joy they had begun to show vanished, replaced by a miniature version of the former stillness. At the table, they again lowered their gazes, answering Madame Chu's questions with barely audible monosyllables. They stopped running through the corridors, and their laughter was extinguished, turning back into whispers. They sought Lena with their eyes, as if needing to confirm that their anchor of security was still there, in the midst of the storm. Their regression was the most painful and eloquent proof for Marcus. The order his mother had come to restore was, in reality, the same poison that had almost destroyed them. Their grandmother's presence brought not peace, but the memory of the prison from which they were just beginning to escape. The conflict materialized in a small but significant incident one afternoon in the library. Lena had found an old storybook that belonged to Sophia and was quietly reading it to the girls, who were sitting in a corner. Madame Chu entered the room and, upon hearing Lena's voice, stopped dead. "That book is inappropriate," she said with a coldness that froze the air. "It belonged to their mother. You should not touch it." She approached, took the book from Lena's hands, and returned it to the shelf with a definitive gesture. "The girls have their own books, the ones I myself bought for them." The cruelty of the act was not in the words but in the intention, to erase any connection to the past that was not under her control, to snatch away a piece of their mother that they had just recovered. The girls didn't cry. They simply remained still with an expression of desolation that broke Marcus's heart, who had witnessed everything from the doorway. This incident sharpened Marcus's deepest moral conflict. Was he betraying Sophia's memory by allowing another woman to get so close to his daughter's hearts? His mother's implicit accusation gnawed at him. At night, in the solitude of his study, he looked at the portrait of his late wife, a vibrant woman full of life, and wondered what she would think of all this. Would she see Lena as a usurper or as the savior of her daughters? He felt guilty for not having been able to console them himself, guilty for having needed a stranger to do the job that was his as a father. His grief had become armor so heavy that it prevented him from embracing his own daughters. And now, the fear of profaning his wife's memory added to the burden, threatening to crush him completely. However, it was a gesture from Lena that began to dismantle that painful doubt. A few days later, While walking in the garden, Marcus heard her talking to the girls near the orchid bed that Sophia had planted. She wasn't telling a story. She was describing with astonishing naturalness how their mother chose the prettiest orchids to decorate the house, how she loved the smell of wet earth after the rain. She spoke of Sophia not as a ghost or a taboo, but as a living, warm presence, an integral and happy part of their lives. Lena wasn't replacing Sophia. She was honoring it, keeping it alive, weaving her memory into the present in a way he had never been able to do. At that moment, Marcus understood that the true betrayal of his wife was not allowing his daughters to love someone else, but allowing her memory to become a source of pain and silence. Madame Chu's patience, however, had run out. That same night, after the girls had gone to bed, she cornered Marcus in his study. She closed the door behind her, a gesture indicating that the conversation would tolerate no interruptions. "This has gone too far, Marcus," she declared, her voice devoid of any warmth. "That woman is creating a dangerous fantasy in the girls' heads and undermining the authority of this house. Either you dismiss her tomorrow morning, or I will be forced to intervene in a way you won't like. This is about the good name of this family, about protecting my granddaughters from improper influences. The choice is yours, but don't pretend I haven't warned you." The threat was explicit, an ultimatum that forced him to choose between loyalty to his mother and the well-being of his daughters. Marcus, overwhelmed by the pressure, didn't have the strength to confront her at that moment. He sought refuge in evasiveness, in the response of a businessman buying time. "Mother, I understand your concern," he said, avoiding her gaze. "I will consider it carefully. I won't make a hasty decision." His response was weak, a desperate attempt to postpone the inevitable. Madame Chu looked at him with a mix of disappointment and superiority, as if she knew her will would eventually prevail, as it always had. She left the study, leaving him alone with the echo of her threat and the weight of a cowardice that burned in his stomach. He knew that his inaction was itself a decision, a betrayal of the small spark of hope he had seen ignite in his daughter's eyes. The tension in the house had become unbearable, a rope about to snap. The breaking point came the next day, in an unexpected and devastating way. Marcus was walking down the staff wing corridor when he heard his mother's voice, cold and sharp, coming from Lena's small room. The door was ajar. He saw his mother standing in front of Lena, who was sitting on the edge of her humble bed. "I hope you understand that your presence here is no longer necessary or desired," Madame Chu was saying. "You will be paid a generous severance for your silence. Pack your things. A car will be waiting for you in an hour." At that instant, Marcus saw Isabel, who had secretly followed her grandmother, standing by the door, her face bathed in silent tears. The girl looked up. Her eyes met her father's, and in them there was not just sadness, but an accusation. A silent question that shattered him. "Are you going to let them take her away?" That look was the final catalyst. The world of business, family traditions, and fear of confrontation vanished, leaving only an elemental and overwhelming truth: his duty as a father. He returned to his study, but not to hide. He stopped in front of Sophia's portrait, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't see a lost wife, but the mother of his daughters. He seemed to see in her painted eyes the same question he had just seen in Isabel's. The pain in his chest transformed not into paralyzing grief, but into a furious and clear strength. The internal battle was over. There was no more doubt, no fear, no hesitation. He knew exactly what he had to do. He opened his study door and walked with firm steps down the corridor towards Lena's room, not as the heir to an empire, but as a father, ready to go to war for his daughters' hearts. That night's dinner was not a family gathering, but a silent tribunal. The dining room, with its long polished mahogany table and crystal chandelier hanging like a frozen sun, had transformed into a battlefield. At one end, Madame Chu presided over the table with the rigid posture of a judge, her silence more eloquent than any shout. At the other, Marcus felt like an accused man, unable to lift his gaze from his plate. And in the center, like the vulnerable heart of the dispute, were Lena and the girls, eating with deliberate slowness, feeling every sidelong glance that crossed above their heads. The clinking of cutlery against porcelain was the only sound, a metronome marking the pulse of a tension about to explode. The trigger had been a simple picnic in the garden that afternoon, an act of joy so spontaneous and messy that for the matriarch, it amounted to a declaration of war against order and decency. Finally, Madame Chu placed her cutlery down with millimeter precision. The sound resonated like a shot in the quiet room. She fixed her icy gaze on Marcus, deliberately ignoring Lena. "Marcus," she began. Her voice was a silken whisper that hit a blade. "We have allowed this situation to go on for too long. "This woman," she said, making a vague gesture towards Lena, without deigning to look at her, "is filling the girls' heads with fantasies, confusing their grief with inappropriate familiarity. We know nothing about her intentions. She could be seeking more than just a simple salary." The accusation hung in the air, venomous and calculated, designed not only to hurt Lena, but to awaken Marcus's deepest fears. The fear of losing control, of being deceived, of failing once more in his duty to protect his family. Lena felt the impact of the words as if they were stones. She kept her back straight, her chin high, but an almost imperceptible tremor ran through her hands, holding the fork midway to her mouth. Her first instinct was to defend herself, to explain that her only interest was the well-being of those two broken souls she had learned to love, but she knew that any words from her would only add fuel to the fire. Instead, her gaze drifted to Emily and Isabel. She saw them shrink in their seats, their small shoulders slumped, the nascent light in their eyes dimming again under their grandmother's oppressive shadow. In that instant, her own pride ceased to matter. Her only fear was that the fragile bridge she had built for the girls to cross back into the world of the living would be demolished before her very eyes, leaving them stranded again on the shore of silence and desolation. It was then that the miracle occurred, an act of courage as small as it was momentous. Emily, the shyer of the two, slid her chair back with a soft scrape. She stood up and, with the solemnity of one about to change the course of history, walked around the table. She didn't go to Lena for refuge, nor to her grandmother to plead. She went directly to her father, stopped beside him, and her small hand rested on Marcus's arm. He felt the contact like an electric shock, an anchor in the midst of his inner storm. The girl looked up, her eyes met his, and then, with a clear, firm voice that no one had heard her use in 3 years, she declared, looking directly at her grandmother, "With Lena, I'm not so scared at night." The silence that followed was not tense, it was sacred, the silence that precedes revelation. Emily's words fell into the center of the table like a stone in a calm lake, and the ripples altered everything. For Marcus, that simple phrase was more powerful than any logical argument, more convincing than any therapist's report. It was pure distilled truth, expressed from the heart of the wound. "I'm not so scared." In that confession, Marcus not only heard his daughter's progress, but also heard the echo of his own failure. For 3 years, he had tried to build a fortress to keep fear at bay, only to discover that he had built it with the very bricks of fear. With her whispered stories and serene presence, she had achieved what his money and control could never buy, a glimmer of peace in the darkness of the night. Madame Chu's gaze wavered for the first time, surprised by her granddaughter's unexpected defense. Before anyone could articulate a response, Isabel, always the more observant, added the second blow, her childlike voice resonating with ancient wisdom. "And she tells us how Mummy wanted us to learn to care for the orchids," she said, looking at her father. "She says Mummy would be proud." This second revelation was even more devastating to Madame Chu's narrative and to Marcus's own doubts. It wasn't about substitution, it was about resurrection. Lena wasn't erasing Sophia's memory. She was honoring it, keeping it alive, weaving her memory into the present in the only way that mattered, through love and stories. She was transforming a painful and forbidden memory into a legacy of pride and connection. At that moment, Marcus understood that the true sacrilege was not allowing another woman to love his daughters, but condemning his late wife to the oblivion of silence. Marcus's inner world rearranged itself in an instant. The fog of doubt, guilt, and filial loyalty dissipated, leaving behind an absolute and blinding clarity. He stood up. The movement was slow, laden with an authority that came not from his surname or bank account, but from the unwavering conviction of a father who finally understood his true duty. He looked at his mother, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see the matriarch he had to obey, but simply a misguided woman, trapped in her own rigid rules. The fear of disappointing her, a fear that had governed him for 40 years, evaporated, replaced by a quiet, fierce strength. He knew the words he was about to utter would break the foundations of his family, but he also knew they were the only words that could begin to build a true home. "Enough, mother," he said, and his voice, though calm, resonated with a power that made everyone at the table hold their breath. "For 3 years, I have managed this house and my daughter's grief as if they were one of my businesses, with control, with distance, with fear of disorder, and I have failed miserably." His public confession of failure was his first act of true strength. He turned to Lena, and his gaze was no longer that of a boss evaluating an employee, but that of a man acknowledging an immeasurable debt. "Lena is not going anywhere. She is staying, but not as an employee whose place can be reminded. She is staying as the person who achieved what I could not, giving my daughters back their voice. She is staying as an essential part of this family's recovery. Every word was a hammer blow against the old structure. A point of no return. The decision was made, the line crossed forever. Marcus approached his daughters and, for the first time, without hesitation, wrapped his arms around them, pulling them into an embrace that was both an apology and a promise. He felt their small bodies relax against his, a surrender he had been waiting for 3 long years. Above their heads, his gaze met Lena's, and in that exchange of glances, a new pact was sealed, an alliance forged in the truth of 2 girls and cemented in the courage of a father. Madame Chu remained seated, her face a mask of disbelief and wounded pride. The control she had exercised over her son for her entire life had shattered. In a single dinner, silence fell upon the dining room again, but it was no longer a silence of tension, but the expectant silence that follows an earthquake, when everyone looks around to see what remains standing and what has crumbled forever. The night that followed the dinner of ultimatum brought no sleep, but a strange and expectant stillness, like the calm that settles in the air just after a storm has passed. Marcus, wandering through the corridors of his own house like a ghost, felt strangely light, stripped of the weight of armor he hadn't even known he was wearing. His mother's authority had vanished, reduced to a powerless echo in his mind. Yet, beneath that incipient liberation, a dull panic simmered. He had demolished the only pillar he knew, obedience to tradition, and now he stood among the rubble of his old life, without a map to tell him how to begin rebuilding. He paused at the door of his daughter's room, drawn by a thread of light escaping from underneath. Fear of the unknown wrestled with a new, fragile hope that whispered to him that on the other side of that door lay the first stone of the new home he had to learn to build. He pushed the door open with a delicacy unfamiliar to him, and the scene he found inside stopped his breath. Lena was not telling them a story or singing a lullaby. She was sitting on the floor on the rug, with the girls snuggled on each side, and on her lap rested an old leather-bound photo album, one he himself had kept locked in a drawer in his study, considering it too painful to be seen. The bedside lamp cast a warm light on the pages, illuminating images of Sophia smiling, of days out, of birthdays, and carefree hugs. Lena didn't speak. She simply turned the pages with reverential slowness, allowing the images to breathe, to tell their own story. The girls weren't crying. They observed the photographs with serene curiosity, their tiny fingers tracing the outline of their mother's face on the paper, as if trying to recall the texture of her skin. It was a ritual of memory, not of mourning, an act of silent love that completely disarmed him. Marcus entered the room, his steps muffled by the rug, and for the first time, he didn't feel like the owner of the house, but an intruder in a sanctuary. He knelt awkwardly beside them, a gesture of submission that broke with years of distance and authority. "What? What are you doing?" he asked, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. Lena looked up, and in her eyes there was no surprise or fear, only a deep, quiet compassion. Remembering, she replied with a simplicity that pierced him. "You can't build a future if you're afraid to look at the past. Your daughters don't need to forget their mother, Mr. Tan. They need permission to remember her." The truth of her words was so simple and so devastating that Marcus felt the ground open beneath his feet. For 3 years, he had denied them that permission, believing that oblivion was a form of protection, unaware that it was the cruelest form of abandonment. It was Isabel who broke the silence, her small voice clear and without a trace of the apathy of yesteryear. She pointed to a photograph of Sophia in the kitchen, with flour on her face, laughing heartily. "Lena says Mummy loved making monster cookies," she explained, looking at her father as if revealing the most important secret in the universe, "and she didn't care if we got messy because she said, 'Joy stains wash off with soap and water.'" The anecdote, so small and domestic, hit Marcus with the force of a revelation. It was a memory he had buried under layers of pain, but Lena had unearthed it and returned it to his daughters, not as a sad relic, but as a living, warm treasure. He realized that he only remembered Sophia on her sickbed, in her absence, while Lena was giving them back the Sophia of life, of laughter and flower. At that precise moment, the great lie upon which he had built his grief shattered. He wasn't protecting his daughters from the pain of loss, he was depriving them of the joy of memory. By making Sophia a taboo subject, a ghost whose name could not be uttered, he had not honored her memory, but profaned it, transforming the love they felt for her into a source of fear and guilt. He had frozen time at the worst moment of their lives, forcing them to relive the day of the tragedy over and over again, instead of allowing them to move forward, carrying with them the legacy of all the happy days that came before. The silence he had imposed was not peace, it was a poison that was slowly killing them inside. And he, in his blindness, had been responsible for administering the daily dose, convinced that it was the only possible medicine for their illness. Then, Emily, the one who almost never spoke, who kept her feelings deep within her, turned to him. Her eyes, identical to Sophia's, looked at him with an intensity that pierced him. Her small hand left the album and rested on his. "It's not that we didn't want to talk about Mummy, Daddy," she said. And each word was a drop of truth falling on the parched earth of his heart. "It's that you wouldn't let us." She paused, swallowing before uttering the phrase that would change everything forever. When you can't talk about someone you love, it's like they die again, a little bit every day. With Lena, Mummy comes back. The revelation was absolute. The true tribute to his wife was not to build a mausoleum of silence around her, but to allow her spirit, her love for life, to continue flowing through the laughter and stories of their daughters. The impact of that childlike confession was more brutal than any adult accusation. "It's like she dies again, a little bit, every day." The phrase resonated in Marcus's mind, demolishing the last defenses of his pride, of his denial. The pain he had held at bay for 3 years with work, control, and distance finally reached him. He broke, not with a scream, but with a silent, heart-wrenching sob that shook his entire body. Tears, hot and bitter, flowed uncontrollably from his eyes. Tears for his wife, for his daughters, but above all for his own colossal stupidity. He had believed himself a protector, a guardian, when in reality he had been the jailer of the hearts of the people he loved most in the world. His absence had not been only physical, but emotional. A disconnection so profound that it had almost cost his own daughters their souls. Disregarding his vulnerability, disregarding that Lena was witnessing his complete surrender, Marcus wrapped his arms around his daughters and held them tight against his chest, burying his face in their hair. This time, the embrace was not a clumsy or rehearsed gesture. It was an act of pure necessity, that of a drowning man clinging to 2 life rafts. "Forgive me," his voice, broken by tears, whispered. "Forgive me, my girls. You were right. I did everything wrong. Forgive me." They did not respond with words. They simply clung to him with all their might, their small arms wrapped around his neck. And in that shared embrace, in that mix of paternal tears and filial comfort, the 3 broken fragments of the Tan family finally began to mend. Lena discreetly withdrew from the room, leaving them alone in their bubble of pain and redemption, knowing that her most important work there had just concluded. The next morning, there was no dramatic confrontation. Madame Chu descended the stairs with her suitcase already prepared, her face an impassive mask that failed to hide the rigidity of defeat. From the foyer, through the living room window, she saw a scene that confirmed the end of her reign. Marcus was in the garden, kneeling on the dew-kissed lawn, awkwardly trying to help Emily tie her shoelaces, while Isabel placed a crown of jasmine flowers on his hair. All 3 laughed. They laughed together, a melody she hadn't heard in years. She understood with bitter clarity that her world of order, appearances, and hierarchical distances no longer had a place in that house. Without a word, she headed for the door. Her chauffeur awaited her. She left as she had arrived, like a retreating cold front, leaving behind cleaner, warmer air, full of promises. The true change was not manifested in grand speeches, but in the simplest of routines. That same morning, the kitchen, which had always been a functional and silent territory, filled with happy chaos. Marcus, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and a smudge of flour on his nose, tried to follow a pancake recipe he found online, burning the first 2 and causing a puff of smoke that set off the fire alarm. Emily and Isabel, sitting on the countertop, laughed heartily at his clumsiness, beating the batter with an enthusiasm that splattered the walls. Lena observed them from the threshold with a cup of coffee in her hands and a smile that lit up her face. Sunlight streamed in through the open window, sweeping away the last vestiges of gloom. The house was no longer a museum. For the first time in 3 long, silent years, the Emerald Manor was once again a home. The months that followed the night of revelation were not an instant cure, but a slow and deliberate learning to breathe again. The transformation of the Emerald Manor began with the sound of windows opening wide each morning, an act that would have been unthinkable before. The heavy designer blinds were taken down and replaced with light sheer curtains that invited the sunlight to dance on the parquet floor, sweeping away the last shadows from the corners. Lena, officially promoted to house manager, no longer moved like a fearful shadow, but with the serene authority of someone who knew her place was earned by emotional right. Her laughter became the new soundtrack of the corridors, a sound that encouraged the girls to join her, and their childish races ceased to be a transgression, to become living proof that the house had ceased to be a mausoleum, to finally become a true home. Marcus, for his part, embarked on the most difficult task of his life, unlearning to be a director, to learn to be a father. His agenda, once full of meetings and business trips, began to fill with different annotations. Breakfast with my princesses. Walk in the garden to look for ladybirds. Build a cushion fort in the living room. He cancelled important meetings, delegated responsibilities, and for the first time discovered that his tech empire did not crumble without his constant supervision. He spent afternoons with Emily and Isabel in the garden, not to talk about business, but to teach them to distinguish the aroma of damp earth, to tell them how their mother was able to know, just by looking at the color of a leaf, if the orchids would bloom beautifully that year. Every story was a golden thread, weaving Sophia's memory back into the tapestry of their lives, transforming absence into a warm and constant presence. The repair of their bond was not a smooth path. There were clumsy moments, awkward silences, and old habits that threatened to resurface. But Marcus learned to apologize, to admit that he didn't know how to do it, and to let himself be guided by the instinctive wisdom of his daughters and Lena's infinite patience. He discovered joy in small things, in the taste of a burnt pancake that his daughters devoured as if it were a delicacy, in the warmth of a small hand seeking his during a walk, in the whisper of, "I love you, Daddy," before sleeping. He stopped trying to control his feelings and allowed himself to feel them, sharing with them not only laughter but also occasional tears when remembering Sophia. In that shared vulnerability, in that brutal honesty, he found a strength he never knew he possessed, a strength that came not from power, but from unconditional love. Autumn arrived, and with it, the annual Family Day celebration, an event that for the past 3 years had been a hollow and painful social obligation for Marcus. But this year, everything was different. The estate didn't breathe formality, but a genuine and contagious joy. There was music. Fairy lights hung among the trees, and the aroma of freshly cooked local treats floated in the air. At the center of it all, Emily and Isabel, dressed in simple white dresses, ran among the guests, distributing small glasses of freshly squeezed fruit juice they themselves had helped prepare. They were no longer the ghost children of the mansion. They were the confident, smiling hostesses, their cheeks rosy with excitement and fresh air. They were the living embodiment of a new beginning, proof that life, even after the harshest of winters, always finds a way to sprout again. At sunset, when the sky was tinged with the same golden hues as that afternoon that changed everything, Marcus went up to a small makeshift stage. By his side, holding his hand, were Emily and Isabel. The murmur of the crowd silenced. Marcus looked at the people, his employees, his friends, and then his gaze found Lena standing among the crowd, observing him with a smile tinged with pride. His voice, when he spoke, was firm and clear, devoid of the businessman's formality. He didn't speak of production figures or market share. He spoke of his family, and in the end, he said the words that would forever seal his transformation. "This year, I have learned that the best harvest is not what is gathered from the land, or what fills our coffers. The best harvest," he said, squeezing his daughter's hands. "It is what grows with patience and love in the heart of a family." The party ended, the lights went out, and a serene peace settled over the estate once again. On the porch of the house, under a blanket of stars, the four contemplated the district in silence. They were no longer a boss, an employee, and two broken girls. They were something new, something that still had no name, but felt solid, real, and eternal. Lena leaned slightly on Marcus's shoulder, a natural gesture that spoke of an intimacy forged in adversity and mutual respect. He did not pull away. Instead, he put an arm around his daughter's shoulders, pulling them all a little closer. The legacy of the Tan family was no longer written in property deeds or bank accounts. It was being written at that precise moment, in the warmth of four bodies together against the cold of the night, in the silent promise of a future where love had finally found its home.